Renee,
Hello. How are
good to
you?
see you. I am fine. I'm fine on this Saturday morning. It's a little dark, it's a little dreary, but hey, it's a great time to talk about fiction and talk about crafting amazing characters, which is what we're going to
Absolutely.
do today. Yeah, I just wanted to introduce my friend Rene Gutteridge to our Facebook and YouTube crowd. And Renee, wow. I think that when I first started writing fiction, it was because I went to Renee's classes at the time. It wasn't WriterCon, it was through our Write Well, Sell Well. But I don't know, Renee. I think that probably that artistic side of me, you just kind of broke down some of those really difficult constructs and, put the cookies on the bottom shelf, so to speak. And I just felt like I can do it. I can do it. So thank you for that. Thank you for
You're
that.
welcome.
You are the queen of story. And I just, I thought I've never really told you that learning story can be so intimidating. And
Yeah.
really today, Renee and I want to debunk some of that, but we also want to talk about characters. And the title that I had, Renee, was, crafting characters you love, but you don't want to invite home. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. And I'm just going to let Renee open up and, just you can share anything that you want to about what you're working on, or if you want to just jump right into characters, that's good too.
Okay. Well, that's a broad choice there. But
Yes.
so I'll just jump into characters because I love talking about writing. It's one of my favorite things, and I do think characters can be intimidating. I think what's hard, I work with a lot of writers. What's hard is you realize when you get into the weeds of a novel, there are a lot of plates spinning. So you're spinning a plot, you're spinning setting, you're spinning character, you're spinning theme. You've got all these things that you have to keep up with. And so if you don't understand the individual elements of the story, then you really do get into muddy waters because you are it feels very chaotic, so breaking each of the story elements down into bite-sized pieces to where you come in feeling authority over it rather than it having authority over you. It makes the process a lot more fun, which is what you want to happen when you're writing a novel. If you walk away from your desk crying every day after you've written, you are not in the right space, and you've got to figure out a few things that need to change. So in terms of character, I'll start with the number one mistake that I see people make with their characters, which is that they create characters that are just everyday people that have no interesting attributes. So you may be basing, a character on somebody or maybe a part of yourself, that you're drawing from, and you have to separate two things. You have to separate real life and fiction life. So in real life, there's a different set of standards for interesting than there is in a novel. And so you may be a fabulously interesting person in you're in everyday life over coffee with friends. Maybe you're the life of the party, but you set yourself inside of a novel and suddenly it does not draw a reader in. And one of the reasons for that is because a reader is reading to escape. They most typically are not reading to find themselves in a book. We live with ourselves every day. We are wanting something really crazy and different. We want to escape into another world. So the job of the novelist is to make a character interesting. And Laurel, as I've shared with you, and I've shared many times, it's the person that you want to observe at a party, but don't necessarily want to stand next to. So if you've ever been to, a backyard barbecue or a party, or maybe it's Christmas with a relative or something, and there always seems to be one person that's just really stands out as either different or over the top, or says the thing that nobody would say out loud, whatever the case. There, and as a writer, you're in the corner taking mental notes, like, this guy is fabulous. I have got, this is terrific. But you don't want to be next to him, being associated with him, typically, unless you are kind of a flamboyant type person. And then I personally don't love attention on me at a party. And so, I'm in the corner, a dark corner, usually just watching everything. But the point being that when you create a character, you've got to make that character interesting enough that a reader will want to stay with him or her all the way through, 300 plus pages or whatever of a novel. So if your character is boring, not even a good plot typically can make the novel work. And so we can get into some of the things that we can do to make a character interesting.
Well, I would love to hear that. And let me ask you one question, Rene, real quickly. So when you have a great plot idea, do you normally have an idea for the character who's going to work in that plot, or does that come later? How does that work for you?
It is every book or story idea that I've had is different. So sometimes I would start with this great plot idea. I've had that happen several times where I've come up with a plot. I have absolutely no idea what my characters are. Right. And then sometimes I'll just start thinking of a great character. Like, for instance, my Boo series started with this great character of this horror novelist who becomes a Christian. And what does that look like? And then I form, this whole world around him. So, it very much depends on how it first, takes root in my mind. And, from there, I have to develop the other side of it. It's usually not both. I don't usually come up with the character and the plot and it's all there together. One or the other usually has to come in second.
That helps. That helps a lot, because I think that is true for me too. When I got Missy in River's Call, Missy was so clear to me. She was just, I knew Missy. I kind of knew what she was going to do and the message she was going to get into. But, with another plot, I've had to say, okay, who is this main character and how can I amp her up? So that she does have a strong character arc. And we can go there now if you want to with character arc. Or, when you have a really strong character, do you have an idea of how that character is going to change at the end of the novel?
Typically not.
Okay.
I don't have a whole character arc usually when I start. I really do a lot of discovery of my characters as I go along. And as you and I have talked about, I'm a seat of the pants writer. So I have my basic plot and my basic characters, but as I take them through the plot, I begin to see and shape them in my mind, which is why most of the time when I go back for my second draft, it is the first part of my novel that needs the most work. Because by the time I've hit the middle of Act 2, I've got my character fully formed. I've got the plot, pretty much worked out, and I'm just finishing it. But it's that first half of the novel where, as I'm working through it, I'm like, oh my gosh, that's it. He's had a divorce in the past. I did not see that, and so I make a note to myself. I don't usually go back and correct it. I make a note. And so that's when I'm working through that first half.
That's so interesting, Rene, because a lot of times for other novelists, it's opposite. They get the first part and they're like, I love this first part, but I don't know what I'm going to do with it, and that whole question of, I don't know what I'm going to do with it is character related. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
it's strongly character related at that point because
Mm-hmm.
the plot has been pretty well set. I mean, there's stuff that has to happen, but it has to be significant for that character at that
Mm-hmm.
point.
Well, and typically what happens when you run into that problem, where you don't know what to do in the second half of your story, is that you have not developed yet your man in the mirror moment. So if if you break down Act Two super simply, the idea is that the character begins this journey believing they want something. And either they get it and they realize that's not what they want, or they don't get it and they realize I have to get it. And that's basically the middle of your Act Two. And from there on, you end up filling in the rest of it and through conflict and problems. So if you have that worked out, usually the second part of your novel will come pretty easily, because really what you have to come up with is problems for them. And a lot of people don't know that yet. They'll start their character on a journey and have no idea really what the character wants. They've started them down this trail, but internally they have not figured out what the character wants. Which you have to figure out two things. You need to figure out what the character wants externally, and what the character needs internally. And once you have that developed, then your storyline falls into place fairly well,
Good.
usually.
I heard a funny phrase. Well, I read a funny phrase. I was working on character and arc and so on, and he was talking about the phrase "stuff that happens," and that sometimes novelists will look at conflict as stuff that happens, but actually it has to be targeted stuff that happens.
That's right.
Pushes against that specific character. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, that is exactly right. Like you're not just wanting to put your character on this very hard journey, of which they overcome all the obstacles. That leaves the reader feeling pretty empty. What they need to have is that plus the internal journey. So if you just have your character overcoming obstacles all the way through, then you've got a person who has developed perseverance, and that's the end of the story.
That's good, Rene. I love that.
and in real life, that's not our journey either. I mean, we develop perseverance, but as we go through problems, what happens? We develop wisdom. I mean, those two things go hand in hand. The more trouble we have in life, the wiser we become as well. And yes, hopefully. But pain and suffering have a wonderful way of teaching us. And yet at the same time, writers tend to not want to put their characters through pain and suffering. They're too nice to them. But in terms of what you're talking about, your conflict does need to drive both the internal and external conflicts of your characters. So while, for instance, if you're a male writer and you are writing a lot of action, your character arc is probably not as steep as something like women's fiction. Right. But at the same time, you look at something like Die Hard, which is a example that's used very often, is you have Bruce Willis's character, defeating the terrorist, but at the end, what he realized is that he loves his wife.
Yeah.
That's the internal journey of the character. And so, it's these kinds of things that the writer has to work in parallel. It's the external pushing the internal, and the internal pushing the external. And these two things work in tandem together all the way through the whole second act.
So good. So good. Well, so the thing that I've really struggled with is the internal conflict on how to show that, because it becomes kind of the heart of the story, really. I mean, the external, of course, is important because it's going to force certain things, but that internal conflict, that seems to be like the soul of that character. And you know how to really do that. Like, how do you reveal that by inner dialogue, dialogue with other characters? How do you do that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's more, I think it's most effective not to rely totally on inner monologue for that, because
Okay.
then what you have is a character telling you everything they feel. And if you've ever been to coffee with somebody where you are getting emotionally dumped on, it can be a really long coffee because
True.
it's just, here's how I feel, blah 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 blah,
Yeah.
and it gets hard to sit through for a while, and you got to
Yeah.
figure your reader is going to be with you for at least a couple of days and probably longer. I'm such a slow reader, I'm going to be with you for a good month, and so I've only got so much tolerance for that. So here's how you do it. You start to bring in these symbolic things that mean something. They're symbolic to what might be happening on the inside. So, for instance, if you're trying to show a character who has finally cut ties with her husband, and she's like, that's it. Instead of having that emotional inner monologue where she's going, well, I've had enough of my husband. That's it. You want to show it. And so the showing of it is she takes out his favorite coffee mug from the cabinet and she marches it out to not just the kitchen trash can. That's not good enough. She takes it all the way to the curb and puts it in the outside trash can, watches the dump truck take it, and it's a big moment for her. It's a tiny little mug. It was ugly, maybe it said "World's Greatest Husband" or whatever. And as she's taking this mug out to the curb, and she's looking at this mug, she's reflecting on how the journey this mug has had with her. She bought it for him on their honeymoon, back when he was the greatest husband. And she remembers when he threw it at her and it broke, and she, like an idiot, super glued it back together for him. And so you've got this thing that you're carrying, this visual object that the reader can watch take its journey into the trash can, while exposing an emotional moment for the character.
That is so helpful, Renee, because I mean, until you start writing a story, it's so much more than what happens, and yet what happens is important. But you don't always know why it's important. But when
Right.
you have those little moments that are, they're definitely something that you're seeing, you're showing, but they're saying so much. I mean, that is golden in a novel, I think, because
I do too. And here's the trick. Here's the little pulling back of the curtain of the writer is when you decide that's going to be my thing, she's going to throw away that mug. You write the scene and then you make yourself a little note, plant that mug earlier.
Yeah.
It's more effective if that mug is seen early on in Act 1, and
Right.
the reader has no idea why this mug is significant, and you don't make a big deal about it. You just, there's this mug, and you draw attention to it so that when it comes back around in the second act, it doesn't, it doesn't seem like you just pulled that out of the hat, but that you have spun this really amazing symbolic thing, and everybody's like, whoa, that's so cool. I mean, it's one of the most common questions that I get asked, it's just amazing how it all comes together, and you thought of this and this and this, and the fact is that it's all put in as pieces, and that it's you go back and you fix the front part so it matches the back part. And readers, they have no idea of this process, so they think that at the beginning of this novel I've come up with this mug idea. And, it has carried through brilliantly all the way to the end. And then now some outliners may have that in their outline, because they're doing all the work on the front end. So they may have developed that. But for the seat of the pantser, I often find those things right in the middle. And then I have to, figure out how to go plant that earlier.
Well, and it's not a hard thing. And usually it's just a note in one of your drafts, whichever draft you're working on, to say, okay, plant this earlier, or, go ahead and plant it then, or, I'll go back to where it needs to be planted and just say, coffee cup or whatever.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's really helpful. I will say that when a story is well crafted, and a lot of times, I mean, for me, it's a huge process and has to do with an editor and a publishing editor. I mean,
right. It's a team.
It's a team. And by the time you get done, you're like, wow,
that
was way better than I thought. Which is
Absolutely.
Really our point as far as breaking down characters, I think. But I wanted to ask you that because I think that sometimes bringing emotion into that character felt kind of maudlin. Like I was like, we don't want to use adjectives, at that point. She felt sad, or she felt very sad, or she felt extremely sad. I would be like, yeah, so I don't, that's not what I no.
You don't want to read that. That's coffee with your friend who's like, I feel really sad today. And then you're like, well, tell me about it. That's coffee. But novels need to be entertaining. That it has to hold the reader's interest, and entertaining takes more effort than just telling the reader how your character feels.
I've heard you talk about trauma as far as picking out a little thing. That like when a character is hit by incredible trauma, that the reality that we should see in a novel too is that the human psyche cannot take in a whole trauma. You talked about the Murrah building bombing and how you saw that computer dangling from a broken window. So that helped me a lot as far as when you have a character and you're in a big scene, you're in a scene like maybe it's the disaster moment, maybe it's the climax, but they're in a scene that is big. And so how do you describe that? And how do you bring in that character's reaction to it so that it's authentic?
Right. So this is one, there's a class that I teach on how film is ruining your fiction. And it's one of my favorite classes to teach, because what is happening in novel writing is that so many of us also love movies that we often start taking the things that apply to movies and applying them into novel writing. Which is not all bad, but then what you end up having is a scene that you're telling your reader about. And so you're describing this whole scene as you see it, as it would unfold in a movie.
Right.
Whereas that is not the technique of a fiction writer. A fiction writer tells everything from the inside out. Everything is seen through the character's eyes, not as if it's being filmed as, in a movie. And so if you bring it in externally and then process it out like that, if they're in a car wreck, instead of describing this car wreck as the car tumbles and all of that, you need to describe it from the inside out and what is happening in the character's head as they're experiencing this car wreck. In a movie, they can slow-mo it down. They can show every little piece of glass flying, but it's not how you write it in a novel. So in the novel, it is how the character is experiencing it. And often how we experience things is through the lens from which we are looking in the moment. So if you've got a character who it comes from an abusive background, they're going to be looking at everything through the lens of abuse and seeing everything differently than somebody else. And so when you're describing a scene, it's often the little bitty things that matter. It's the little bitty moments that you pull out of the character's head, you know, as something's happening. I mean, if somebody is having, you know, in the middle of a car wreck, well, first of all, that's really hard to describe because it happens so fast. I mean, the car wreck, you're hit, your brain literally can't process it at all. It cannot be processed. You're not thinking, I'm tumbling down the road, I hope I don't fall off that embankment. It's just, you know, so you have to find another way to present the trauma. And, you know, sometimes you'll see it where there's a flashback, and as you are rolling towards your death, you begin to think about that time that you walked on the beach with your daughter or whatever. It's a way that the brain processes trauma. And so if you'll work towards something more like that, rather than trying to describe the actual traumatic event, then, you know, I think you'll have a better emotional reaction from your reader, which is what you're wanting. You know, sometimes as writers, we feel like we have to describe every little detail. A lot of writers that I work with, one of the biggest things that we work with is the idea that we do not have to describe from A to Z every little moment as we're going through. You pick the moments to describe, and you can time jump, you can pass over, you know, you can say she took a phone call in the afternoon and went on. You don't actually have to describe the phone call. But when you're beginning to write a novel, you feel like you have to fill in all the blanks for the reader. And that's just not true. What you're trying to do with your character is evoke emotion from your reader. And, you know, that's your primary goal. So, you know, but there's also, I will also make a case for the idea that I have read before novels where there is an expectation of wanting to see something that the writer decides not to let you see, which I think sometimes is a mistake. So, for instance, if it's the moment that the mom finds out her son has been killed in combat, there has to be something shown in that, because the reader wants to take that emotional journey. You know, you might, you know, feel like, well, you know, everybody knows her son is now dead, or that I'm going to describe the long-term emotion of this. But really, they want to be in that moment with that mom when whoever comes to the door to tell them, you know. So you don't want to necessarily skip that and say, well, they'll catch on. You've got to make sure that you hit all those emotional high points too.
Yeah. You taught me something years ago, and you said, don't write from a telescope, write from a microscope. So, or something like that. But anyway,
I don't know. I have no recollection of that, but
I know. But it was because I was writing from the telescope, looking down at a scene, looking down at what was going on, and instead of focusing that it was through the eyes of that young girl, it was through her emotional mindset, it was through, you know, like all of us, we're totally different, and she had different experiences. She kind of saw as a little orphan child, basically. So that was, to me, helpful. And I do see that with beginning novelists, the whole telescopic thing. And it makes sense that comes from film, because of course we see in film what we don't see immediately in a novel. But then again, the beauty of a novel is you experience it emotionally through the eyes of another person, which is pretty crafty, but pretty cool, I think.
It is. And I mean, the balance is that, you know, you do have to describe the setting, You do have, to anchor a scene in before you can even get your character into it. So that's,
Right.
part of what we learn and to do in setting and narrative and stuff.
Yeah. Good. Well, I'm glad you brought out the setting as well, because I think and this, we can talk about that another time, but often it's in relation to that character. I mean, everything is revolving around the character at that point. And I know there's been like a big, it's kind of cliche now with the plot driven, character driven, but it's not that. It's just that you are engaged in a journey with a character. And so what matters more? Well, they both matter. The journey matters, the character matters. So crafting that, and crafting the setting and the relationships and all of that is really such an adventure. And I just appreciate that you can help break it down in some practical ways, Rene. Tell me another something that you find in novelists, as far as maybe mistakes or maybe limited knowledge as far as crafting characters. Is there anything you can think of in that way, Rene?
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing that's pretty hard to learn, and something that writers have to work towards as they're beginning to write fiction, is learning their voice. And that's such a hard thing when you say, the voice of your novel or the voice of your character. People get confused about what that means, but really what it means is how your character sees the world. And so the idea being that, here's a fun exercise to do. Take a piece of paper and, included in 5 characters, make one of the characters yours that's in a novel, and you're writing the same scene. The character drives up on an old barn in the middle of nowhere. And write that from 5 different characters' points of view, including your character, and make sure that your character's distinctness is there in that, and look at the other characters and see how they see the barn. How does the city slicker see it? How does the little girl see it? How does your character see it? These kinds of things. It's a really interesting way to learn to develop your character's voice, because when you start to see your character's voice set against other character voices in the same scene, you begin to see, oh yeah, that's how I want her to see the world. And then you can, go on that way.
That is a great exercise, Rene.
Yeah.
That is a great exercise.
And then the other thing that you see a lot of is too much inner monologue, thoughts to themselves. There's no reason to have a lot of that in your novel. Your voice of your character serves as its own narrator to the story. And so you don't have to have your character constantly going, well, she thought this and she thought that, then she thought about this and she thought about that. You're trying to show your way through that, and how she sees the barn, or how she sees the man across the street, or how she's processing the fight that she's in, serves to develop your character. How she's reacting to everything is character development. And you as the reader can tell, well, this is how she thinks about life, because this is how she's treating that man.
Yeah, that's good. I did try a novel without any internal dialogue. It didn't work out very well.
You don't want to take it away.
You need a little bit.
you've got to have internal dialogue, but often people get super heavy-handed with it.
They do.
Yeah.
Well, and the other interesting thing I wanted to ask Rene was about dialogue and how character is revealed through dialogue, and we're talking about within relationships. So, we can pinpoint it, maybe the relationships that are closest, but really, how does dialogue, or how can dialogue be a good tool for revealing character?
Yeah, it's again another great element that. So if you look at all the elements of fiction, every element serves to develop the character. If you look at it that way, that everything that you're putting there is to develop this character, because ultimately the character is what is going to evoke the emotion of the reader. So again, dialogue is another way to do that. And it's not always everything that's said. Sometimes it's everything that's not said. If you've got a shy character, or like the character that I wrote in my life as a doormat, who was, a doormat. I had a lot of fun in contrasting what she was saying out loud versus what she was thinking. Because you would hear her think. Somebody would come ask her for a favor, and she's like, there's no way I'm doing that. I'm not doing it. I'm putting my foot down this time. And then she was like, oh, sure. When would you like me to come over? And it created great comedy, and so, how they say it, dialect, you can put a little bit in, but you don't want to be heavy handed with it. We've probably all read novels that were hard to get through because of the dialect. You can hint at it without making the whole thing about the dialect. But anyway, the idea being, how would my character say this? What would my character say in this moment? That's super important. If you've got a shy character that has a hard time standing up for themselves, and then you put them in a angry conversation and you have them coming out swinging, you're not being authentic to who your character is, unless that's the moment when they finally decide to stand up for herself, right? Or she breaks, right? And so, all of that is, to be considered. And then everything that your secondary characters are saying you're utilizing to develop the character. So, you're using other characters' dialogue to set you up as a writer so that you can reveal things about your character.
That's good. That's good. I was going to say, really, people, and this is true in life, we are revealed in the ways that we deal with conflict, or the ways we deal with confrontation. And so it's always good to throw that in there, because it does reveal that character, because it's true. Like you were saying, coffee with your friend. Okay, that may reveal a lot depending on the friendship and so on. But if you get into conflict, well, that reveals even more.
Right. And then taking it a step further, when you get in conflict with a friend, I think most people, you just don't see most people in a restaurant rising to the level of conflict where somebody stomps out. Like, I can't think of a time when I've actually seen somebody stomp out of a restaurant or throw a table over or something like that. But in fiction, it's okay to do that. It's okay, because you want to see things in fiction you don't get to see in real life. There may be times when you've witnessed a boyfriend treating a girlfriend badly at the table next to yours, and you're just thinking to yourself, boy, I sure wish she would throw that water in his face. I wish that she would do that, and that hardly ever happens. But if you see it in a novel, it's, so much fun, because you're like, that wouldn't happen in real life, but I am loving this moment right now.
I always look at it kind of like condensed life, You only have one novel to show condensed life. So it's kind of like orange concentrate. You better make it potent, make it undiluted.
Undiluted. And when you're thinking of dialogue, you have to go into every conversation or piece of dialogue with this idea that it is targeted towards something. So I'll see a lot of dialogue passages that are not going anywhere. They're just two people having a conversation. it's, maybe the writer is thinking, well, I need to introduce both these characters, so I'm just going to have them greet one another and have this conversation about how their days are going. Not a good idea. Every piece of dialogue has to serve towards developing the character or moving the plot forward. Or ideally both of those things at the same time is ideal.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's a good exercise to eliminate all of that. Eliminate any kind of greeting, unless you want to do a real confrontational greeting, like, scumbag.
Right. Unless it serves a purpose. Right.
Exactly.
Exactly. Just we talk about clipping the front end and the back end of conversations off. If somebody's ending a conversation on a phone, you just kind of have to, it's kind of funny. I have to tell this little story. Like, most people are like, well, thanks for calling. Well, thank you for calling. You have a good day. You have a good, okay. All right. Bye-bye. You take care, and this whole line of thing going on. And so in fiction, we just need to go, something like, even just mid conversation, you just cut it off because nothing else needs to be. But the funny thing is that's how my dad, treats a phone call. So my dad he's never been a big phone talker. And so when you're having a conversation with him, we're talking, and then I'm like, well, yeah, that sounds good. We'll see you Saturday. And then you hear click. And he just, when the conversation's done, it's just over. He'll just hang up the phone, and he's not being rude. It's just like, there's nothing else to say. So it's just over, it's just always made me laugh.
My parents were that way, Rene. And it was, I think, from the years that long distance cost something. Right. And, it's like, it's a boy, the whole, it's a boy, that whole little phrase in there, because they were saving money and you couldn't talk too long. So you just basically got the gist of it, and boom, they were out.
And then that was over. And so think about that. Just right now, I'm like, that would be a great character trait to give somebody. Like, if you have an older person on the phone, that's such a quirky, great thing. Like, they just hang up, just mid-conversation. It just makes them interesting. Like, that's just an interesting little thing that you can fit in. Yeah,
that's so good. That's so good. Well, and then I have just one more area I wanted to kind of talk to you about how character reveals theme, how theme is revealed through character. Because a lot of times we kind of have an idea. I kind of have an idea when I'm crafting a story idea of what I want to say. Okay, so it's not heavy-handed, but I kind of have an idea. Like, the one I'm working on now is the daughter of a woman who was basically a mass murderer. So, okay, this is fantasy. So, but basically her mother had a past, and she feels, the conflict of being the daughter. Is she going to be like her? And she's always looking for ways that maybe she's like her mother. And so I kind of knew that. I did, obviously, more than kind of knew that as I was crafting the story, and kind of had an idea of how I wanted to shift that into theme. But tell me about your process with that, Rene. How do your characters say what you want the story to say, or do you have a pretty good idea before you start of that?
Well, you'll read a lot of different things about theme, and I have a pretty strong opinion about it myself, and so it's what I teach, but it doesn't mean it's necessarily the right way. But my opinion about it is that if you have to work so hard to get your theme out through your character, then you don't have a strong enough theme. So in other words, a theme should be all the pieces together working in unison, so that at the end of the last page, the reader knows the theme without anybody having to have said it. So you wouldn't want, to me, you don't have a strong enough theme if you have to end with your character saying, and then I forgave myself.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Like, if that's not running strong enough through your whole story to where you feel like you have to put something at the end to make sure the reader understands the theme, And then some writers, it is coming through their story, but they don't trust it. So then they go ahead and put a little mini sermon at the end to make
That's so
sure,
good, Rene.
that people get it. And so, your theme is not, to me personally, I don't think about my theme hardly ever when I'm writing. I don't think about it. I know what I want my character to learn. And I know what I want their takeaway to be in life. And I don't think about that in terms of the reader. I think about it in terms of my character. This is what I want my character to do and be at the end of this novel. I want my character to, at the end of this novel, forgive herself for this thing or whatever. And that's what I drive the whole story towards, so that at the end, I don't have to take time to wrap it all up in a pretty bow for the reader, because and a lot of times, I mean, I would argue that a lot of people will read a book, set it down, and if they were asked what the theme was, couldn't quite tell you, but they know they were really moved by the story, and they go back and keep thinking about it, Now,
and that's what you want.
That's what you want. A lot of publishers want to know the theme ahead of time, but I think that's also because they want to know that what your story is about.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, they want to make sure that you have that character arc in your head, that you have the idea of what is this story about, rather than, I have a good plot. I'm sure,
Just a
it's going to be super
story.
entertaining. Right. Yeah. Right. And so, and sometimes my themes have changed, that from what I thought it was going to be to what it ended up being. So
I appreciate hearing that. I think it's important, for writers to know that, depending on how you're made, because even if you are a strict outliner, there are still discoveries that you make along the way. It doesn't always end up the way you thought. I mean, I've learned to do an outline. Of course, it's pretty loose, but maybe because it's loose, I make several outlines along the way. I go, oh, no, it can't go that way. It's got to go this way. So then basically it's just, this is what I see happening, in the rest of the book. So I'm not sure that's called an outline, but at least I have a sketchy plan that I know what's supposed to happen when.
Yes.
Unless there's a discovery, and then, hey, that could shift.
Absolutely. I mean, I've had a book that I ended up killing a main character that was not intended to be killed. But I ended up killing him. And the reason was that I didn't have enough conflict in my story. And I realized it halfway through, that the stakes were not high enough. And, so that was a decision I made. And so when the publisher got the manuscript, they had read the synopsis, and when they got the manuscript, I got a phone call on that one. But they loved it. They were like, absolutely, that had to happen. They were just like, we were shocked because, we thought he would be at the end, and sure enough, he wasn't.
Yeah. So do you use like the little personality profile, character profiles at the beginning, Rene? Or, I mean, I have friends who get on Pinterest, they get a picture, they get a song. I mean, I don't do any of that. Not that it probably would help me if I did, just to do a real thorough kind of profile about that character.
Well, I think there's no wrong way at all. My writing style lends itself to deep point of view. And because I'm operating in deep point of view, more important than what my character looks like is how my character sees the world.
Okay. So explain, just give us a little snippet for the definition of deep point of view.
So deep point of view just means that I have sunk real deep into how this novel is told through the character's point of view. So in other words, some novels you'll feel more of a narrator involved who is not necessarily from the character's point of view, but he's helping paint the picture of what's going on. A lot of stories like men's fiction or whatever are told that way, where you're just not sinking too deep into the characters' emotions and feelings and all of that.
Right, right.
But for me, I love to have a great point of view from my character. I utilize it, especially in comedy. I utilize it because it's really how they see the world, and sometimes they see it so wrong, and everybody in the room knows it's wrong. Like you, the reader, you're like, oh boy, you know, I'll never I mean, I love Mrs. Kilpatrick from Skid because you know, and she's so much, she was good in the movie, but she's so funny in the novel because she, you know, she just swears that you cannot trust a single woman that wears polka dots. Like that's her thing. Like if she's wearing polka dots, she's an untrustworthy woman, and she's trying to give advice to our main character. And, you know, those are really fun ways when you're in a deep point of view to not just have your character, you know, be a hero, but why not have your character be an anti-hero, you know, where everything they're saying is wrong. They have a skewed look on life, you know it. And as the reader, which now you're anticipating, well, clearly she's wrong about life. I wonder what kind of trouble this is going to get her in, you know? And so it's fun. It's a fun way to tell a story. And so I don't utilize character profiles at all. And in fact, I'm so terrible at it that there have been novels that I have actually turned into publishers where the character started out with one name, and halfway through, it's often because I've had, you know, a few times in my life where I've had some medical things where I've had to step off a novel for a month or so. And then I'm trying to come back into it. And he started out as Bob and he ended as Chuck. And I never, you know, I'm sitting in a deep point of view. And so because of that, I'm not using their name a lot. You know, they're not speaking to themselves with their name and stuff. And so anyway, that's happened. But I don't think it's wrong. I think it's super helpful if people want to do that. But I also think that you can't use those things to replace how your character sees the world. So a lot of times people will fill out a lot of these sheets and put Pinterest pages up of their characters, but then get caught up on describing, you know, their mannerisms, filming them in essence.
Good. I am glad that you're going there, Rene. I'm glad you're going there because that is a real no-no as far as like a long list of flipping her blonde hair over her shoulder. It's like,
Right. Which incidentally, I mean, you have to, now again, there's levels of point of view, but typically none of us look in the mirror in the morning and brush our brown hair. Like we are not thinking of the color of our hair. The character is not thinking of what they look like unless it's a moment where that's the intentionality of the, you know, the scene. But, you know, it just
it's more like counting the number of brushes that you have, you know, that you brush your front tooth on, you know, okay, there have to be 42 brushes of the toothbrush. That's significant.
Yes.
Because it's revealing the character.
Yes.
He's not thinking about the fact that his hair is curly or that his eyes are blue or, you know, whatever.
That's right. You are losing a moment to reveal your character when you decide to spend time on their physical attributes rather than their personality attributes.
That's so helpful, Rene. That is so helpful. With some of these things, you know, when I was thinking ahead at Rene and I talking about character, I thought, oh my goodness, character is so much fun. But learning to craft characters that are memorable, that really matter, that really go through an emotional journey that you remember, is a high level of craft. And unless we have little techniques that we can hinge pin, that we can hook into, like I love, you know, writing 5 different points of view about the same barn, you know, anything that will help us practically, you know, I think of Katniss Everdeen, you know, I remember Katniss. I remember following her I read all 3 of the trilogy of Hunger Games, like boom, boom, boom. I remember her character even now. So
Mm-hmm.
I remember that she was so young and
Mm-hmm.
she was so strong, but she was placed in an environment that no one could survive emotionally. And to
Yeah.
me, that was the theme, that the whole thing of putting our kids on the altar of, whatever and expecting them to survive it anyway.
But think about this. If that hadn't been made into a movie, I bet you couldn't tell anybody what she looked like.
No,
Like
you're right.
it's when you remember a character, it's not like when, you'd be like, well, she was 5'4" with curly blonde hair, blah, 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 blah. The character's physical attributes shouldn't even be mentioned unless they are being used to form who the character is. So if she's got curly blonde hair and she uses it constantly to flirt, totally put it in,
Yeah.
But otherwise, I mean, I've written entire novels where I have not described a single physical attribute of my character.
Mhm.
And part of that is because I want the reader to fill in who they see. Readers like to come up with a character,
It's
and
true. It's
and I
true.
might put a little something in there, but it's just the least of my concerns of making sure the reader knows what the character looks like, unless it's important to the story.
I do think that that's one reason that people prefer books over movies, or a book over a
Mm-hmm.
movie,
Mm-hmm.
because they read the book and they've already got in their mind what that character looks like and how they responded. And then in the movie, like, that's not what, you know. So that's a successful book.
Mm-hmm.
That's a
Yeah.
successful novel to engage a reader's imagination so thoroughly that they like the book better than the movie, I think.
Yes. I agree. I agree.
Well, very good. Well, I knew it was a huge topic. And so forgive me for the open-ended statement at the very beginning. So Renee, tell us about character. It's very complex.
It is. It's complex, but I think we covered a lot of good ground on it. I think it does, like anything else. It takes time and practice to learn to craft a character, and it is a lot of fun. It's really a lot more fun in novels even than in screenplays. In screenplays, so much is dependent on the actor bringing the character to life, so you're just kind of giving a general sense of who the character is, whereas in the novel you get to play all of it,
Yeah, it
and
is. It's
that's
an
really fun.
amazing landscape to fill in. So, and also Renee and I wanted to give a little promo for WriterCon 2021,
Yep.
and you can find us on writercon.org, and we're up and going, and wow, things are moving so quickly, Renee. But basically, Labor Day at the Skirvin in Oklahoma City, and
Yep.
it's all of Labor Day weekend, and actually even master classes on Monday, which is kind of like the university level
Yeah.
classes are on Monday. They're additional, but the conference itself, Friday through Sunday, is just jam packed with
Yes.
all kinds of great teaching about craft and what works as far as crafting a novel. And of course, that's not all of it. There'll be
Yeah.
marketing and branding and all of that. Plus, of course, so many connecting opportunities. And so we just want everyone to come. I mean, we're definitely reemerging, Renee. So
Yes.
yay.
Yay for life getting back to normal.
Yes, it will be live streamed also, I
Mm-hmm.
believe.
Mm-hmm.
Or you can join us on site, which of course will be wonderful. So anyway, Renee, thank you so much. It was so much fun to talk to you. I learned a lot. I hope our audience did too. I know they did. So
Awesome.
have
Always
a
fun.
it was fun. Have a great Saturday.
Okay, thanks. You too.
All right, bye.
Bye.